Good afternoon, and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Fiscal Year 2022 Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program Notice of Funding Opportunity webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take you through the items that you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. At this time, I would like to hand the presentation over to Brian Rada, the lead community planner in the Amtrak Asset Line Planning and Oversight Division at FRA. Brian?
All right, good afternoon, everyone, or if you're joining us from Western US, good morning. Glad to have everybody on here. I'm going to give an opportunity for all of my my co-presenting colleagues to also say hello to everyone, and we can use it as sort of a double mic check for us and make sure everyone is being heard well. So, Doug.
Thanks, Brian. Doug Gascon, Chief of the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division here at FRA. Good afternoon or good morning, as Brian said.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. My name is Sergio Coronado. I'm a transportation industry analyst with the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division. Pass it off to Michael.
Hey there, Michael Johnson, industry economist with the FRA. I'll be going over the BCA portion of this presentation today. Laura.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Schick. I am a supervisory environmental protection specialist in the Environmental Review Division, and I'll be talking about NEPA and other environmental requirements for FRA grants.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And Sergio, I think we noted just up your volume a bit. You were a bit faint there, at least as I heard it. So with that, I'll proceed along and go through our agenda for this afternoon session. I'll be starting with an overview of the partnership program, talking about the basic eligibility requirements, the purpose of the program, and some other things to keep in mind as you consider applying. I'll hand off to my colleagues then to go through more of the procedures about how you do apply and to present several areas of best practices for you to keep in mind as you prepare applications under this NOFO. And then we plan to have a significant time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. We'll begin with those pre-webinar questions that some of you submitted in advance, and then proceed on to questions that get provided during the webinar, which I already see some folks putting some questions in the questions for presenters pod. Feel free to do that throughout. All right, so I'm going to talk about the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Program with a focus on the national side of the program. So the program purpose is to fund capital projects that reduce the state repair backlog, improve performance, expand or establish new intercity passenger rail service, or enhance rail safety. And as noted, the notice we are talking about here was for the projects not located on the Northeast Corridor or NEC. I'll talk about that a bit more later on. And the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity that we published last week on the 7th, made $2.283 billion available. That was a combination of some supplemental advance appropriations from Congress for fiscal year 2022 and annual appropriations from Congress for fiscal year 2022. And we have a 90-day application period, which means that applications will be due by 5 p.m. Eastern Time on March 7th of 2023. I will note you may, under this program, submit a concurrent application. So you could submit an application that you also have pending or that you've submitted to another departmental or FRA program, such as the Chrissy or Raise program. And you can also resubmit applications that you may have submitted in prior rounds that were unsuccessful. Those, if they're resubmitted, there's no prejudice against those and not being selected the first time. You are welcome to resubmit an application. So as many of you probably know, this NOFO serves as the first notice of funding opportunity that we have provided under the new authorities and funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill. And this slide here summarizes some of the key changes. most significantly, I think, the program expanded its eligibilities, especially the 2 bullets here about expanding or establishing new intercity passenger rail service. Under the prior authorization, we were essentially limited to existing services and only portions of the railroad network that were owned by Amtrak or another public entity. But as you see from the bullets here, you can expand and establish new service, and it allows projects on privately owned railroad lines, such as freight railroad owned lines, so long as those lines are used by intercity passenger rail. There are some modifications to the selection preferences, which I will go through as we go along as well. One I'll note, under the FAST Act version of this program, under the prior authorization, there was a preference for a 50-50, a 50% or greater non-federal match. That no longer is a statutory preference. This remains an 80-20 program, but that was a change. We did get a new tool available to the Secretary and the Department called a phased funding agreement, which could allow us to enter into multi-year funding agreements for a project under certain circumstances. And there's a note about some of the funding splits are different between how the national program and Northeast Corridor portion of the program funding is made available. But for you all, I think the core thing is to know that this NOFO makes $2.283 billion available. There would be more in future years under national as we work our way toward at least $12 billion available over the 5-year period. So now I'll move into the core elements of project and program or eligibility under the program. There's sort of 3 dimensions. So the first one here, who are the eligible applicants? And then I also will discuss what constitutes eligible projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about the non-federal match requirements, which is another component of eligibility. So the list of eligible applicants is very consistent to what it was under the prior program. The only new addition is the federally recognized Indian tribes. And this is a pretty consistent list of applicants to some of FRA's other programs, if you have familiarity with them. You should think about who you are in this list. You know, do you represent a state or a group of states? Are you a public agency or public chartered authority? The only one I usually feel I need to translate is just that the political subdivisions of states, that tends to mean things like municipal governments or county governments, any sort of political entity that is, under a state's umbrella. And I will note that any combination of the above can come in still together. They could partner on an application and submit together. There's a note at the bottom as well that you can include project partners that are ineligible entities like private sector firms. But if that happens, that private sector entity needs an eligible applicant to be the lead and to be the recipient of the federal dollars. So you would need to partner with one of the eligible applicants listed here. And I'll talk about project eligibility. So there are sort of the first 3 bullets are basically define the universe of project eligibility here. You can have a state of good repair focused project, bullet number 1, where you would have a project whose purpose is to replace, rehabilitate, or repair infrastructure, equipment, or facility used for intercity passenger rail service, and with the outcome to bring those assets into state of repair. You could have a project that improves intercity passenger rail service performance, and several factors are listed there about how it might expand capacity or increase speeds. But there could be even other dimensions that you would provide about how your project would improve IPR performance. And as noted, new under the current authorization, new under bill, you can have a project that expands or establish a new intercity passenger service. So expanding an existing line could mean new stations on that line, new frequencies, could mean extending the line beyond its current terminus. And of course, establishing a new IPR service would mean, in introducing intercity service on a line that does not currently carry any IPR service at all. And the 4th bullet notes that, and I think this is likely, many of your projects will probably do some mix of the 3 or a mix of 2 of them. And that's totally fine. You can have a project, excuse me. You can have a project that mixes and matches from that list. That's anticipated. And then the last bullet notes that in addition to funding the construction of these projects, we also can fund here planning, environmental studies, and final design in service of these projects. And there's a couple definitions provided at the bottom of the slide about what constitutes a capital project and what constitutes a major capital project, both of which are more thoroughly described in the NOFO itself. So along with the project eligibility, there's also sort of the where in the project development and life cycle process is your project. So we have a slide here just to indicate, as you consider what you'd be applying for, we did describe in the NOFO 3 tracks to consider applying. So if you are contemplating a project-specific planning application, for example, some earlier conceptual planning toward a project that would be an eligible construction project here, you would want to come in under track 1, as it's described in the NOFO. If you're proposing to come in for project development activities, the core of which tend to be the preparation of environmental documentation and preliminary engineering documents, that generally constitutes our project development stage. You would consider applying to track 2. And then if your project would be at the final design and construction phase, and that's what you're seeking funding for, you'd come in at track 3. This is not a project that funds operations. You see our restoration enhancement program can handle that. And higher level regional corridor or system planning is also not covered under the Fed State Partnership Program. Just a few definitions to keep in mind. If you're not familiar with these are in the NOFO, and I, of course, encourage you to read the definitions carefully there. But I did want to note, I think I've already mentioned intercity passenger rail, or IPR, several times. It's statutorily defined as sort of the inverse of commuter rail passenger transportation, or commuter rail. So I've provided both of those definitions here. I think generally, if you have any questions on this, you can think of commuter rail as usually within a single metropolitan area, serving that metropolitan's core and suburban areas, whereas intercity passenger rail most often involves transportation from and between different metropolitan areas, with routes, usually at least 30 to 50 miles and sometimes up to several thousand miles in length under IPR. And then I mentioned earlier that, we, of course, are here on the national program, or national portion of the Fed State program. So the definition of the Northeast Corridor to keep in mind is the NEC spine, which runs from Boston, Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. And then there are a couple Amtrak-owned branch lines between Harrisburg and Philadelphia, and Springfield, Massachusetts, and New Haven, Connecticut, as well as a small spur in the New York area, that are included statutorily in the definition of the Northeast Corridor under this program. So for you all, I would expect you all are proposing projects not located on that NEC, which is great. If you have projects that are on the NEC, we'll be issuing a separate NOFO to make funding available for those NEC projects in the near future. So that covers applicant and project eligibility. My apologies, I'm still fighting a bit of a cold. So now I'll talk about the non-federal match requirements. So this is an 80-20 program, meaning the federal share of costs, what you can request for the federal government to fund, cannot exceed 80% of your total project cost. And then conversely, at least 20% is required to be put up by the applicant as non-federal share. If you don't demonstrate that you have at least 20% non-federal match, your application would be ruled out as ineligible. Amtrak, if they're involved in the application, has permission to use its ticket and business revenues as non-federal sources. Excuse me. And then there's a few notes here about the process, which you also will see in the NOFO, about how you demonstrate that you have met the minimum standard. We do ask you to identify your sources of the match, and you can have that match be constituted as cash or in-kind contributions, non-cash contributions, as long as the in-kind contributions are provided consistent with the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. And we do encourage you, in fact, we would expect that if you are getting a funding commitment from a party who is not the lead applicant, right? If it's not all coming directly from you as the lead applicant, that you include signed funding commitment letters from those other entities. So if you have project partners who are contributing part of your non-federal match, we want to see that you, in fact, have the approval of that organization to pledge that their funding could be involved in the project and is pledged toward the project. Now I'll talk a little bit about how your applications will be evaluated and selected. For those of you who may have applied under the Fed State Partnership Program before or other FRA programs, I think the technical merit criteria here will look pretty similar to what you have seen before. But broadly, you will be evaluated on two overall criteria. One are technical merit criteria, which generally judges the quality of your application, your demonstration of readiness, your demonstration of your technical capacity and financial contributions, and other factors showing that you've minimized the risk and that we would, if we were selected, we would likely have a very successful project and manage a successful project with your organization. And then you have the project benefits side, which has to do more with the actual project you are proposing and the outcomes and impacts that that project would have. And here you can demonstrate those benefits through the benefit cost analysis, which we'll discuss later, as well as describing other impacts on the railroad system, impacts on rail safety, competitiveness. You see some of the other factors here. And notice a few new factors added in bill, which includes impacts on employment impacts around stations or historic districts, and whether your project serves historically unconnected or underconnected communities. And so it has something of a social equity component to it. And then there also were some tweaks in bill to the selection preferences. One including if you have a project that would improve the financial performance, reliability, frequency, et cetera, of an Amtrak route, if you demonstrate that in your application, that would gain a selection preference. And then while it is a preference, the last one to be identified and consistent with a corridor inventory prepared under our FRA's new corridor ID program, we are not anticipating that selection preference to be active for this NOFO due to timing, since the corridor ID program is still in development. And of course, applications here are due in March. That will all predate the publication of such an inventory. We do anticipate using that on future national NOFOs and using this preference in the future. Also in the universe of evaluation and selection criteria, additional selection criteria that the department selecting officials and senior officials may use are looking at the project's impact on our key departmental objectives, which are listed here on the slide and also spelled out in the NOFO. And I would encourage you, if you have a project that is very responsive to one or more of these factors, that you thoroughly describe that in the application and put that forward as one of the sets of benefits of your project, because these objectives are ones that the department has indicated they want to advance through their grant programs and funding that the department makes available. I'm also going to just briefly describe a couple other requirements of the program. I want to highlight for everyone's awareness that the program is subject to FRA's Buy America rules, and there are new requirements that were recently enacted in the Build America, Buy America Act, or BABA. You see on the left-hand side here, and I believe in the web links below, a link to a website where you can find out more about Buy America. And on the right-hand side with our sort of wrench and screwdriver graphics, various key points, including that you just need to consider the Buy America requirements in your project planning, design, and budget. And if you are considering seeking a waiver from BABA requirements, we would ask that you develop and submit a domestic sourcing plan as part of your application. And of course, the kicker at the bottom notes that waivers are not guaranteed. They are granted only in limited circumstances, and they can delay projects. And a bit more on the domestic sourcing plan. If you take that route, you should detail the extent to which the systems that are proposed to be in a waiver are going to be imported and the extent to which they could be sourced domestically. You need to indicate how in the future for maintenance and replacement of the initially imported goods you would use domestic sources, and indicate the number of domestic jobs that could be generated by the project and whether that more jobs could be transitioned to domestic jobs in the future. Finally, for me, a couple other requirements and restrictions to note. A bullet at the top about pre-award costs, which follows basically the Code of Federal Regulations rules about pre-award costs. There's a bit more about that in the NOFO. And then I want to reiterate, excuse me, while FRA is prohibited from providing partnership program grants to commuter rail transportation, we do recognize and understand that commuter rail, as well as freight rail, particularly relevant for the national program here, often operate in concert with intercity passenger rail services. So there's a number of shared corridors where multiple types of rail service are occurring. And that our primary intent in the Fed State program is to make reasonable investments in intercity passenger rail transportation. And we recognize and know that many of those projects may be located on shared corridors where commuter rail or freight rail would also benefit, and that's fine. But if you are proposing a shared benefit project, we need you as an applicant to clearly demonstrate how that project directly benefits the intercity passenger rail service and describe how it would be a reasonable investment in the intercity passenger rail elements, independent and separate from the other benefits to the other transportation purposes. We still do ask you to submit the full benefits picture of your project, but if you're doing a shared benefit project, describe your IPR benefits separately and make sure you make the case that it's a reasonable investment in IPR. We have provided grants to commuter and local transit agencies in the past when they have met our requirements and demonstrated that the project they're proposing has reasonable benefits. So it's certainly possible, and we know there are a number of shared corridor areas out around the country. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Doug.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Again, I'm Doug Gascon, Chief of the Rail Program Policy and Performance Division. I'm just going to walk you quickly through the overview, the NOFO overview, and how to apply, since Brian did a great job describing the program itself. First off, so what is a NOFO? There's really two main purposes of a Notice of Funding Opportunity. It announces the grant opportunity, letting people know that it is on the street, what the deadlines are, how much funding is available, and it contains details about the requirements. And Brian spoke to the program requirements, which are extremely important. And the NOFO also goes into great detail about sort of the just general application requirements and procedures that applicants must follow to apply for, and then if selected, implement federal grants. So it provides a lot of detail. They are long documents. We don't love that, but there's a lot of required information that we want to make sure that folks are aware of. And so while lengthy, we do recommend sort of reading and rereading and rereading it again, so you make sure that you're following all the directions. The NOFOs are sort of structured, as laid out here. We have, a general program summary, which is sort of telling about what the program's purpose is, dates, again, addresses, contact information. We have our contact information for the presenters will be at the end of this slide deck. They are also listed in the notice. We have a general email inbox, which is the best way to seek information. That means all of us can access that and get back to you perhaps in a more timely fashion. Our names are also listed there for additional questions if need be. And again, the NOFO just sort of breaks out the order of information here that's helpful for applicants. Again, the program description, the award information. These next three are really going to focus on the purposes of this webinar, the eligibility, application submission process, and how we're going to review your application. And then there's a whole bunch of information there about Federal Award Information Administration that's going to be helpful. And then folks have to follow and be aware of as they seek to put the application together and ultimately submit. So where do you start? So the easiest way and probably the where everyone would like to begin is on FRA's Competitive Discretionary Grants Program webpage. The link is provided here. There's a screenshot as well. If you look at the sort of tabs across the top of our website, you can sort of find us under the Grants and Loans tab, and then Competitive Discretionary Grant Programs. And again, this one will be listed at the top because it's open and accepting applications. You can click directly on the program heading, and that will take you to the specific program page. That'll have lots of information, some historical information, because again, while this is a greatly expanded program, it did exist on the FAST Act. So all of our grant programs and our website functions this way. You have the immediate information about the open NOFOs as well as historical data. And the link to the NOFO there is highlighted as well. And should also be links to trainings and guidance, and like this webinar link is on that page as well. So where is the NOFO? Where does it live officially? We published in the Federal Register. Again, this was on, I believe it was December 7th. Published in the Federal Register. A 90-day application window gets us to March 7th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's important. I want everyone to remember that date and time and the time zone, because any application submitted after that will not be accepted. And it does take a little bit of time. It takes a lot of time to put applications together. We understand that. It does take time when it's fully complete to upload it in the grants.gov system. So we really, really encourage folks to be aware of that deadline. Do not wait until the last day, because everyone tries to do that, and the system can be slow. And if you don't leave enough time, you might find yourself submitting a late application. So again, please don't wait till the last day and upload your application with sufficient time. You can also sort of search for it here. There's a screenshot of what the Federal Register notice looks like. The assistance listing number there, 20.326, which is highlighted. That's crucial because that's how you can find it in grants.gov, which I believe is the next slide here. Yes, so this is where you're actually going to submit your application once you've read the NOFO and you've decided you're eligible and your project's eligible and you've got all the documentation prepared and ready to submit. You'll submit it through grants.gov, and if you want to find it there, again, under the search grants tab, you can enter in the CFDA number to get a really direct link to this notice. You could also search by Department of Transportation or FRA or Open Grants. There's a number of ways to get there, but this would be the fastest for you all. And that's sort of where, on the next slide, I will show you sort of what that's going to look like. So if you go to the FY22 FedState National page in grants.gov, here we have sort of like the layout of what you'd expect to see. You have the synopsis here, which again repeats a lot of the same information, the deadlines, the opportunity number, funding amounts, and these sorts of things. So this is really an important place. Has links to the NOFO at the bottom of the page. You can also hit that apply button when you're ready and get started. So that's sort of a very important to familiarize yourself with grants.gov if you haven't used it or submitted a federal grant. It's really good to get in there and familiarize yourself with it, because it is, it can be a little bit of a process uploading your documents and all the attachments accordingly. So again, this information, this page includes all the information you will need to read the NOFO, understand the requirements, and begin that application process. So, okay, so how do we apply? Taking a little bit step back from the actual application piece is the first thing you must do is obtain a unique entity identifier through the SAM.gov, which stands for System for Award Management. So in April of this year, the federal government discontinued using what was called DUNS numbers, which used to be the way in which applicants would be able to identify an active registration, that they'd be able to submit grants for applications for federal funding. The DUNS number was replaced with a new non-proprietary identifier, again, provided by the SAM.gov folks. It's called the Unique Entity Identifier, or Entity ID. To sort of find a request, a UEI, please visit www.sam.gov. Then you have to register in the SAM system. Entities registering in SAM must submit a notarized letter appointing their authorized entity administrator. SAM registration may take 2 or more weeks to be renewed. It can take longer if you're setting it up for the first time. FRA does not control or have the authority to expedite SAM registration or SAM renewal requests. Anecdotally, I will say it is taking longer this fall, at least, with previous the NOFOs we had on the street. Some folks realized that the SAM either registration or renewing process was taking longer than the advertised 2 weeks. So I think if you listen to nothing else that I say today, as soon as this webinar ends, please check your SAM registration status. If it needs to be renewed, please immediately begin that process, because it can take, it's taking a lot longer than 2 weeks. And again, you need to be registered and approved in that system to apply for grants. We cannot accept any applications outside of grants.gov, and you need to have all your registrations up to date to be able to do that. We can't have, you can't email your application because your registration isn't renewed in time. So I really want to stress that. Please check your status immediately. And if it's all up to date, great. If it needs to be renewed, please start that immediately, because it can take some time, and the added stress of finalizing your project with this uncertainty of whether your registration is getting renewed in time or not, it's not worth it for anybody. So please get on that as soon as possible. So what do you include in your application? Brian sort of described this, and I'll do a little bit more detail as well. Again, the required documents, we lay this out in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Project narrative. This is, I think Sergio is going to get into this in a little more detail, so I won't talk too much about this. But again, tell us about your project, the problem you're trying to solve, how you're going to solve it, how much funding is that going to cost, the schedule, all the project partners, all the work that's gone into it, both the why it's a great project and the benefits stemming from it. Statement of work. Again, this is the scope, schedule, budget, and performance measures for your project. This is required. And in the NOFO links to where you can find these templates, we have these 4 templates. And again, these are 4 distinct templates. They all need to be included in your application. They can be combined under one larger attachment, but all of these 4 statement of work templates need to be included in your application for it to be considered complete. Environmental compliance documentation, again, depending on the project lifecycle stage. If you're applying for PE NEPA, obviously you're not going to have a final document, right? But sort of speak to maybe the work that's gone into it prior to that. And I know Laura will speak in much more detail about the environmental requirements under NEPA, so I won't go into that. But again, sort of whatever documentation you have to prove whatever stage you're in, and what stages you've completed, or what the estimated time you want to complete that stage, and certainly whether it's environmental or the last bullet here, agreements. The status of those agreements are very important. If not complete, give us an update on when you expect those to be complete and the status of those negotiations, as well as the benefit cost analysis. And I know Michael will get into more detail here on those documents. So these are all required documents. Again, if applicable on the ownership agreements, if the applicant is not the infrastructure owner, we will require that written agreement prior to obligation. A more competitive application has that agreement in place at the time of application. So just something we know this can take time to hammer out and to finalize. A lot of partners involved in some cases, and everyone needs to be assured that their interests are protected and everyone's on the same page. Those can take some time. And if they're not complete at the time of application, again, speak to the status and when you anticipate those being completed, because again, project readiness is a very important evaluation factor here. And if it's clear from the application that finalizing such agreements may take some time, that might ding your application review. So again, it doesn't have to be complete, but speak to the status of it in your application as best you can. We also have some required forms that need to be submitted as part of your application. Again, these are found on, well, the first few I think are found on in the grants.gov system. The SF424 is the initial form you fill out with your official request. And then there's the sort of assurance budget and assurances, depending on the project you're seeking or stage of the project you're seeking. There's the assurances and certifications. These should be in grants.gov. The FRA F5 F251 is an FRA form, as is, I think, the SFLLL. All of these forms are either available in grants.gov, or the NOFO provides links to FRA's website where you can find them. So these are all required as well. Again, the lobbying activities one, if that's a part of your entity or outreach here, that would be submitted. But again, the NOFO should provide direct links to where you can find these, as grants.gov will as well. So where can you find some additional information and help? Again, we run the program, and we will do that process. The actual submission of your application goes through grants.gov. And so again, this is a bit of a screenshot here of the synopsis page. And it's got links to the NOFO. It's got the help center, the contact center information here. They are 24 hours. This is where you would go if you have questions about the program and eligibility, that sort of thing. Please come to us. If your questions are technical in nature, in terms of technical and computer, I guess, the actual process of uploading documents and that sort of thing, you would go to the grants.gov support folks. So I want to make sure you guys are aware of that distinction. And then I want to just give you a quick overview of sort of the application review and selection process. Again, the first sort of step, right now we're in the open application window. Everyone's working hard on putting their applications together. Our team is available to answer questions throughout this entire process, and I will highlight this later. We'll be doing additional webinars, probably on more targeted issues, not this overview, the general overview, in January. So look out for some of those. I don't know if the dates are listed at the end of this or not, but we'll be doing more of this technical assistance public outreach, and our contact information is there at the end. But once you are done with your application and you submit it successfully in grants.gov, it goes through several phases here on our end. Intake and eligibility is the first one. Essentially, was the application submitted on time? Was it complete? Does it have the required minimum non-federal match? Is the applicant eligible to apply and receive funding on the program? Is the project eligible? Is the project an eligible activity to be funded under this program? So all applications sort of go through that hamster wheel. Those that end up on the outside of it, that are eligible and complete and on time and all that great stuff, they enter into the evaluation phase. This is where technical merit reviewers look at the applications for the technical merit and project benefits. There is the BCA evaluation, and there's the NEPA readiness evaluation, a risk assessment there. Those are sort of three concurrent technical reviews that go on through your whole application, through the application evaluation period. After the evaluation reviews are over with, these decisions are, the projects are all briefed to the senior leadership here at the department. They take into account the technical merit reviews and the BCAs, the NEPA readiness assessments. They take into account the evaluation selection criteria that Brian spoke to earlier, and final decisions are ultimately made and announced via press release. So that is the formal notification that the program has wrapped up, and that time frame is generally about 7 to 9 months following application due date. So just for everyone's expectations there, that's sort of tracking to late summer, fall, just based on when the application deadline comes in and how much time it actually takes to review these applications. Again, I think in total, an eligible application will have been read in full by no less than 10 people here at FRA. So everyone gets a fair shot, and everyone gets, gets the fair consideration under the program. And for more information on the just overall application process, we've got this cool little graphic on our website. Here's the link here. It's also on our that grants application page. Sort of goes through the whole system again, the whole phase here that guides our applicant period, and then all the way through our internal process. So for more information on that, please check that out. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sergio Coronado to discuss some of the best practices.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'll be covering best practices, specifically focusing on the project narrative and the statement of work. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So really, the best overall advice I can give folks is to read the NOFO very carefully. Read it more than once, in fact. This presentation is meant to serve as a tool, but at the end of the day, the Notice of Funding Opportunity document is the official document with all the required information and necessary steps. The instructions are clearly laid out there. And so, again, the most helpful advice we can provide is to look at the NOFO and read what's required in there. So as you kind of go through this, or as I kind of go through this, I'll jump into the project narrative and statement of work, as I mentioned, and then the BCA and environmental readiness will be covered by my colleagues. So jumping into the project narrative, here we have the 11 elements of the actual project narrative. I'll go over each item with some high-level details to kind of give you a sense of what you should address in each element. But keep in mind, again, the NOFO has more details in it for each of these actual elements. So, I'll just give you a very brief overview. One element I do want to drive home, though, we get this question a lot, is about adhering to that 25-page limit. That is a very strict limit. Going over that, any pages over 25 will not be reviewed. But I also want to point out the fact that the cover page does not count against that 25-page limit. We get that question a lot as well. So jumping into the cover page, as stated, literally a cover page for your overall application. We're just asking to kind of indicate, whether this project has been submitted to another federal grant program, whether that's an FRA program such as Intercity, or whether that's another USDOT program such as RAISE or the MEGA program. We ask that you include, the program year that it was for, as well as the lead applicant for this application, the project cost, the life cycle stage, which Brian covered, the intercity rail route that's going to be benefiting from this application, as well as the infrastructure owner. If it's not yourself, whether that's a freight rail company or Amtrak, we just ask that you identify that infrastructure owner. And so when we get to the project summary, this is really a brief area for you kind of to describe your project in very short manner, 4 to 6 sentences. Just describe the project challenges and how you'll address those project challenges. Think of it as an elevator pitch. When you're developing it, really think about the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why. Include a simple statement highlighting the benefit of the project. There are plenty of areas in the rest of the narrative to describe the various challenges and the project benefits. Really focus on the simplicity here. A perfect example of this actually is the FY21 selections for federal state partnership. You can go ahead and take a look at those and really just model your project summary after those selection briefings. Diving into the project funding, obviously there's a lot of elements here, all of which are important. We do ask, of course, that you include the eligible cost, specify each source of non-federal match, provide details about the in-kind match, go ahead and indicate public versus private sector match, describe the non-federal funding arrangements, attach funding commitment letters, that's pretty important, identify if the proposed match will not be available until a certain date, or the funds must be spent by the deadline. And there's some additional requirements there for a major capital project. We ask that, of course, you provide an annualized budget, indicate the initial funding request based on current cost information, as well as forecasted funding requests, and any additional cost estimates, as well as the total project cost for the entire expected duration of the project, as well as indicate whether you're going to seek a PFA. Now, I'm not going to cover anything on applicant eligibility or project eligibility. Those were covered by Brian earlier. So we're going to go ahead and skip those and jump right into the detailed project description. So when you look at your detailed project description, this is really the area that you can kind of expand on, thoroughly discussing those transportation challenges and benefits, including some data to support your project benefits, of course. If you have multiple components of a project, you can describe how it's going to be sequenced here. Photos and diagrams are great here, of course, and identifying any host railroad operators, beneficiaries, or partners is a great area for this as well. again, really only include relevant information. There's no reason why you should start diving into the railroad's history here or any unrelated project, other projects, that is. Of course, quantify when possible. This is not going to be the only area for you to kind of expand on the benefits of your project. So I'll double back on that when we get to evaluation selection criteria as well. So jumping into project location, this is pretty straightforward, obviously. Identify the cities, counties, and states where your project is located. Include a map of the project, the intercity rail route that's benefiting as well. Identify railroad mileposts where relevant. For those grade crossing projects, include anything from the USDOT National Highway Rail Grade Crossing Inventory Number and geospatial data such as longitude and latitude. Obviously, there's free tools out there such as Google Maps. And I also just want to point out the description of demographics is good and great as long as it's relevant, implementing Justice 40 data where possible. But just keep it relevant and necessary to demonstrate your point, whether you're trying to point out the safety or economic benefit of your project, addressing specific evaluation criteria, of course. But again, just keep it relevant. Don't dive into the demographics of your entire state if it doesn't apply to your project. So again, a little more information on the grade crossing aspect of it, just citing the railroad owner, the primary operator, the inventory number, the roadway at the crossing. FRA actually has a safety map that contains a lot of this information that's available on our website. You can find all the details there from milepost, crossing, inventory number, everything you need can be found at this resource. So a great tool to point out. So when we dive into the evaluation selection criteria, Brian covered those early. This is obviously really where you start to hone in on your project's benefits, addressing the criteria. As I mentioned before, here's where you kind of get to write your own evaluation for your project. But we also ask that you don't rely solely on the contents of your detailed project description. It's okay to repeat key points in this section. This is really your opportunity to link everything you've covered into other areas, from project location to your project summary. And you're strongly encouraged to address each element within the evaluation selection criteria. We often see some applicants skip over the criteria, assuming they've covered it elsewhere. Maybe they covered it in their project description. But as I stated, it's really important that you kind of repeat these key points in this section. And I also just want to point out for those projects with commuter benefits, it's okay to dive into those, but really hone in on the intercity rail benefits here. This is kind of your opportunity to make those shine. So again, okay to include those commuter rail benefits, but make sure you're pairing them with benefits to intercity passenger rail. So when it comes to the project implementation and management, really this is where you kind of highlight your past experiences managing and overseeing similar projects. Whether those are FRA projects, as I mentioned, CRISI, or other DOT-funded projects, that can be RAISE, formerly known as TIGER, or FTA-funded projects. This is your opportunity to kind of tell us what kind of work you've done with similar projects, whether that's a similar scope or a federally funded transportation project. This is your opportunity to tell us how successful you've been in either applying for or completing those projects. Describe, of course, the expected arrangement for project contracting, contract oversight, change order, and risk management. And for those projects in final design, we ask that, of course, you resolve any remaining uncertainties or risks associated with changes to design and scope of the capital project. And I just want to point out, some folks like to submit short resumes as evidence for project implementation and management. Those are welcome as hyperlinks, of course, or attachments. Now, I'm just going to cover environmental readiness at a very high level. My colleague, Laura, will do a better job of diving into this. But for those projects that are applying for Track 1 or project planning, or Track 2, known as project development, we understand that NEPA is likely in progress. So to that extent, we ask that you provide some draft NEPA document if possible, but also identify any planning or environmental analysis done to date. Make it clear that where you are in your planning stage. Of course, if you're not a Track 3 applicant. For those who are applying for Track 3, construction grant application. Provide a copy or a web link, of course, of that completed NEPA document. That's very important. Identify any environmental permits or approvals that may be needed besides FRA approvals and permits, that is. Provide the status, expected completion date, and or a copy of those permits or approvals. And again, this is just a very high level overview of this. My colleague Laura will kind of do a better job of describing what's necessary. Now, diving into the statement of work, Doug kind of covered it very briefly, and I just want to point out that obviously we have these templates readily available for folks. And again, the best advice is really to just follow the templates we provided you with. Those are available on our website. I'll also note that performance measures is new this time around. It's probably not something that many of you are used to, but it is a required document as well. You know, if your application doesn't contain all aspects of the statement of work, which is the statement of work itself, the schedule, the budget, and the performance measures, your application will be considered incomplete. So to that note, make sure you are completing it following the template, but also submitting all the required documents. Now, when it comes to the actual statement of work, you know, it's pretty straightforward. Be logical, organize your tasks into a very straightforward, document. Think of it in a way of describing the document to someone who has no relevant rail experience. That's really what a statement of work is. After reading a statement of work, this brand new person should have a solid understanding of what this project is, what the key tasks are going to be, how much it'll cost, how long it should take. So again, you really don't need to dive into the benefits here. You really just need to tell us the scope of work that you're completing, how long it'll take, and how much it will cost. The benefits are better suited for the project narrative. So think of it that way. And statement of works are often updated following selection as the project moves into award. So provide us with the best amount of information you have at the time, knowing that we will work with you after selection. And I just want to point out a resource that we have as well. We have the capital cost estimating, which is guidance for our project sponsors. When you're developing your project budgets, make sure to use FRA's capital cost categories. This just allows for consistency in submissions across our applications and across various projects. So that's also available on our website. You can go there and you can see all the statement of works as well as the capital cost estimating guidance. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to my colleague, Michael, who will walk you through the BCA portion.
Thanks, Sergio. So this is going to be a high-level overview of what a benefit cost analysis is, or BCA, and how it's related to the grant application process for those that are unfamiliar. But if you've gone through this process before, not much has changed. But for more in-depth details, we have extensive BCA guidance updated with 22 alterations on the DOT website with specific examples, figures, and calculations. I believe that there is a 2023 guidance being developed, but it won't be released in a time frame that would affect this application. So I would just prefer the 22 document while you are putting together your application. I'm going to move forward here. So with the BCA, clarity through focused descriptions, activities, outcomes, costs, and benefits goes a long way in communicating applicant projects to reviewers, BCA reviewers. Within the BCA, it's important to succinctly describe projects and their variant scenarios, and this will allow comparison of diverse projects to go smoothly and their various scenarios. We will get into the detail of BCA steps and cases in the next slide, but just note that the BCA is an integral part of the application process, as well as the reviewing process, the secretary taking into account the BCA during the selection process. And I believe in the Fed-State partnership, all types of projects require a BCA in some form or another. I've seen some questions on planning projects. We'll try to answer those at the end of the presentation here. So slide 2. We want to look at project costs both against the projected benefits of the project and the case should the project not occur. So you need to detail your base case, alternate case, and benefit timeline. Your alternate case should have specific monetized effects supported by assumptions, data, and calculations which result in the benefits of the project to the public. The smaller, more specific the effect, the better, as long as it can be supported. Again, look to DOT BCA guidance for details. And finally, calculating results and discounting the benefits to the base year is essential. So we briefly covered the intro to this on the last slide, but let's go over the base case and alternative cases here. So the base case, sometimes called the no-build scenario, is the estimation of the world should your project not occur. This could entail a bridge failure, link 3 rerouting of traffic, environmental damages, etc. The alternate case, sometimes called the build scenario, is the world in which your project is implemented in the state in which you apply for it. It's important to note that your BCA should present analysis for a single project. We often see projects that are under an overarching program of many projects, and BCAs for the whole effort are often submitted. Only your project and its direct costs and benefits should be analyzed in the BCA. It's important to have different BCAs for different projects. This is touched on a bit in the DOT guidance as well. The timeline of the project should be straightforward, with how many years your benefits accrue to society, presented in spreadsheet format. Again, proper discounting of values is important here to fully understand the value of the project and its benefits in the present, looking outwards into the future and discounting those benefits to the present moment, or whatever your base year for your base case might be. Again, detailed guidance on discounting is in the guidance. Moving forward, as I mentioned in the last slide, the BCA is accounting for differences between the base case / build, no build scenario and the alternative case in which your project is implemented, the negative aspects of the world in which your project doesn't occur, and the transportation and other benefits your project will leave in its wake should it occur. There are some examples below. The second bullet here, future projects are relevant. Oftentimes we'll see benefits included because a certain project will be a step towards a larger project that will be completed down the line. Those benefits of that nature should not be included. So we have the examples here of intercity passengers with changing modes, mode diversion, which we'll get into a little bit more, and some points on host railroads, changing speed and weight restrictions, and different growth rates. I often see issues with growth rates in BCAs, so it's important to make sure those are conservative, or if they're not, accurately and properly backed and sourced and cited. Okay, moving forward, back to more details on benefits and costs. At times, your projects may have negative financial consequences on society, and you should account for these with a negative dollar figure. A project could create a situation slightly negatively impacts traffic in one area, but the overall project improves movement in a way that outweighs the setback. Make sure your benefits and costs are in the right place. O&M is a cost, reduced O&Ms tend to be benefits. There's also the case of disbenefits. The residual value of infrastructure is a benefit. There's also further examples on the slides and in the guidance for benefits, disbenefits, and how and where to appropriately place those. So we've covered the need for detail and clarity. It's important to provide sourcing and documentation for all data, parameters, inputs, values, growth rates, etc., especially if it comes from a non-DOT guidance source. Non-DOT sources or those that are referenced in the guidance are totally fine. We often find that there are, especially for new and innovative projects, there is a lack of available data, but in kind of the federal sourcing. But if you have evidence that supports your locality with a different data source, just cite it and explain how it affects the benefits of your project. So on to modal diversion. Modal diversion is a frequent outcome of transportation investment projects, especially with rail and highway, but its impact can be difficult to calculate correctly. The DOT guidance has a lot of info on modal diversion. In fact, it has this whole section on it. It has info on induced demand from the creation or construction of an infrastructure project, different marginal benefits, etc. There's some examples below here for allowable results of modal diversion, but I would get deep into the guidance because it can be a little bit nuanced, and it's definitely dependent on a case-by-case basis as to what is allowable. So it's important to understand what is a transfer of value within a society and benefits to society overall. Transfer of benefits are usually not allowed, where it's one entity or group of people is benefiting from something and then it's shifted over to another. That's kind of just a net. It's a non-gain, either positive or negatively, and benefits to a society overall would be benefits that accrue past just a transfer value to other entities in society. Anyway, look to the guidance for details and feel free to ask any questions. So looking at some final tips and tricks, these are some good tips and a summary for what we discussed. Feel free to ask further questions at the end of the session. Just one extra tip to aid reviewers in assessing and locating your calculations. I advise to have a summary spreadsheet in your BCA spreadsheet to display a sort of table of context as to what is in the sheet and where certain benefit and calculations are located. The BCA review process can be lengthy and extensive. And like I said in the beginning, clarity goes a long way. And this also applies to your calculations and when you present them in the actual spreadsheet format. So it goes a long way to list where certain things will be with the summary sheet. So finally, here are some links to BCA guidance and rail-specific FAQs. I believe we'll send out the presentation. So all the links mentioned will be accessible. One last thing I want to address quickly is the importance of qualitatively and potentially quantitatively showing how projects support resilient supply chains. As we're all aware, supply chain efficacy and goods movement fluidity has become a big topic nationally and with respect to infrastructure investments as well. So I urge you to consider how your project contributes to the goal of creating a more robust and resilient supply chain. I think it's something that it is highly important. That's all I have for now. We're going to move on to Laura Schick, who will be discussing the environmental aspects of the project application process. And again, feel free to ask us any BCA related questions in the chat and we can get to them later. Laura, do you want to take over?
Hi, yes, thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk briefly about FRA's environmental review and compliance requirements. The provision of federal grant funding triggers a variety of laws and regulations regarding the stewardship and protection of the natural and human environment. So on the next slide, it lists several of the resource areas and requirements that we typically encounter with rail projects. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is commonly referred to as the umbrella law under which a variety of potential environmental impacts are identified, evaluated, and mitigated. Because the nation's railroads date back to the 1800s, rail infrastructure, including stations and bridges and tunnels and even entire railroad corridors, are often considered historic properties. And therefore, FRA-funded rail projects frequently require review under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Other considerations include bridge and culvert work affecting wetlands and rivers and streams, vegetation and tree removal affecting protected species and habitat, noise, vibration, and air quality impacts caused by construction activities or rail operations. And of course, we must also consider impacts to the communities, including vulnerable populations where rail projects are proposed to be located. So I want to highlight some fundamentals that are helpful to know if you're applying for and receive a Fed-State partnership grant. The kind of environmental information and documentation you're typically expected to provide as part of your application will depend on which track, 1, 2, or 3, as defined in the NOFO, that you're applying under. And I'll provide a bit more detail in the upcoming slides. Something else important to know, FRA does not necessarily have to start an environmental review from scratch for every project. We may be able to use relevant information that was previously prepared for other projects in the area or for other agencies. So if you have existing documentation or information that you think may be relevant for FRA's environmental review, please provide it. I'm sure you've heard the saying that less is more, but in our case, more is more in terms of any existing documentation that you may be able to include with your application. And lastly, it's important to understand that if your project is receiving FRA funding, environmental review must be completed and approved by FRA before you can construct your project. Not completing NEPA prior to construction may jeopardize grant funding. Now I'll briefly go over what we would like to see depending on whether you're applying under tracks 1, 2, or 3. And I know this slide says both tracks 1 and 2, but typically it would be under track 2 where you would use FRA grant funding to pay for the preparation of an actual environmental review document and perform associated environmental analyses. So if this is what you're seeking to use grant funding for, it's still helpful to provide as much detail as possible in your application to help inform the level of effort that will be needed to conduct those reviews and ultimately produce a document that would enable your project to move into final design and construction in the future. Under track 2, depending on the scope of your project and the potential for environmental impacts, there will be one of 3 types of NEPA document that will need to be prepared. These are a categorical exclusion worksheet, an environmental assessment, or an environmental impact statement. Post-selection, FRA would make a NEPA class of action determination, and then preparation of the NEPA document would become one of your deliverables in the FRA-approved statement of work. In a few slides, there will be a list of websites and webinars where you can learn about these 3 NEPA classes of action. And ultimately, remember that it's the earlier the better to be thinking about potential impacts of your projects on the human and natural environment, any stakeholders you may need to coordinate with, any permits you may need to obtain, etc. So for track 2, depending on how much preliminary project planning you may have done to date, you may wish to go ahead and include a draft CE worksheet with your application, or at least identify the CE categories that you believe your project may fall under. And you can read about FRA's CE categories at the links provided here. The majority of FRA-funded grant projects do qualify for a NEPA CE. However, large-scale construction projects involving multiple alternatives, or projects involving a lot of public interest or controversy may require an EA or even an EIS. And now I'll talk briefly about track 3. So you'd apply under track 3 if NEPA has already been completed or is underway, and you're seeking grant funding for final design and construction for your project. So with your application, provide a copy or a web link to the approved NEPA document or the anticipated date it will be completed if it's still underway. And also let us know if there have been any changes to the proposed project scope and or the environmental setting since the date of NEPA completion. If you have an approved NEPA document that's 5 years old or more, or environmental conditions have changed, or your project scope has changed, FRA will likely have to do an evaluation of the existing document to determine if it's still valid or if a supplemental environmental analysis would be necessary. In the next few slides, there are a variety of websites where you can learn about environmental review in general and about FRA's requirements. So I really encourage you to take some time looking at our environmental webpage. And again, there's a bunch of links here on the screen and on the next slide and on the following slide. And as I previously mentioned, rail projects frequently trigger the requirement to consider impacts to historic properties. So I encourage you to learn a bit about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, especially if your project involves a potentially historic bridge or is located in a commercial or residential historic district, or it involves a lot of ground disturbance. in previously underserved areas where archaeological resources could be present. And I know this was only very few minutes on FRA's environmental requirements. We do have entire webinars devoted to these topics. So I encourage you to go to our website and watch them, especially if you haven't received any or many federal grants in the past. And the previous slide had the an email address that you can reach us at if you have any general questions about our environmental review requirements. And that's it from me. So I think now we're going on to a recap.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So just quick recap reminders to wrap up. So we do remind you, read the NOFO carefully. The webinar here and material here is all based on the NOFO, but the NOFO goes into more detail and is your official reference source for program requirements. Make sure you submit everything that's required so you have a complete application. Just be clear and direct in responding to the criteria. And the note on the bottom, please be sure you submit your application on time. We do not review applications that are received late, even if that lateness is due to some sort of technical or systems issue outside of your control. We hold firm on our deadlines, so be on time, be early in submitting your application. Don't risk submitting at the last moment. I do also remind you, we often see some errors in funding and budget amounts across applications. We really encourage you to make sure that your amounts match, especially make sure your amounts match for the amount of money you're actually requesting from the program so that we know that that's consistent across your various documents. You can, we do encourage you to include letters of support with your application as supplemental materials. And in preparing the application, we often suggest you have some sort of cold reader review the application file as it's getting final, just to ensure that it's telling your story well and you've clearly described your project. Here, I think there were a question or two about it as well. This is kind of our general life cycle and time frame, just so you get a sense. We're now in the the application phase. Once applications come in, it will take us some time to select applications and to do the evaluation review. And this is a kind of a typical timeline from selections forward. So, we can be in a pre-obligation stage with the recipients, finalizing our agreements, like the SOW and scope schedule documents, and finalizing those. That often takes 6 to 15 months, depending on the amount of work remaining to be done. And then you enter an obligation where you have the project is executing, and then there's a grant closeout and final invoicing and performance reports at the completion of the project. And I know post-obligation here says 2 to 5 years, but of course the actual period of performance of your project may vary widely depending on how complex or large scale it is. And then I want to note, this will not be your last chance to get all your questions answered, because I'm sure we won't be able to get to everything that's come in the next little bit. We do plan to have 3 additional information sessions coming up in January and February after the holidays. Dates are not finalized yet, but will be soon. And so you can keep an eye out for invites to these. One of them will dig deeper into eligibility questions and agreements with host infrastructure and the relationship with Corridor ID, which I know there were a number of questions on. Second session will focus and be particularly helpful for applicants who might be proposing major capital projects. And the third will be revisiting the project narrative, the statement of work requirements, and provide official details on those. So keep an eye out for those. And I will note, we also anticipate, hopefully in January, a Northeast Corridor focused general webinar like this one today to parallel. That will be following the publication of the NEC NOFO, which again should be coming soon. And I'm going to leave the presentation here on our contact information, just so you have these as well. Our general inbox is right there at the top, the FRA-NOFO-support. That's that general inbox where you can reach the whole team. And then for particular subtopics, there are some inboxes and emails for those of us presenting here today.
Thank you all for joining us today for the fiscal year 2022 Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program, FSP National, Notice of Funding Opportunity webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be available on FRA's website in the next week. The webinar will end in 20 seconds. Please copy or screenshot the contact information on the screen. Please note, we will email all web links to you after the webinar. Again, this webinar has concluded. Thank you so much for joining us.